Hello and welcome to the July 2019 layout update for the Trent Valley Railway. In this update we'll look at the wiring for the main Fiddle Yard. I've tried to then wire up each of the track sections on the Fiddle Yard right next to each other, so you'll see. We'll look at the progress on the point motors for the layout. Here are just two of them, which these sit in the very middle of the Fiddle Yard. And we'll have a look at a few trains moving in the Fiddle Yard. Throughout the end of June and the most of now July, I've been progressing with the wiring up of the main Fiddle Yard. I've also then installed a lot of the point motors at the garage end of the Fiddle Yard here, and then for the points in the very centre of the Fiddle Yard. Most of the work which I've been doing has been very much underneath the baseboard, so there's not too much progress to report on top of the baseboard here with the track. This is very much as you saw it in the previous June update, and a lot of the work that goes on underneath the layout baseboard is very difficult to film. So a lot of this update will be very much still pictures, showing you the work that I've done underneath the layout boards, and where possible filming those sections underneath there to show you the wiring that I've put in place for the main Fiddle Yard. Whilst I have been progressing with the wiring, this then means that there are some trains that have now appeared on the Fiddle Yard, and there's just a selection here of some of the eventual rolling stock that I have for the layout. Hopefully you'll see these running towards the very end of this layout update. What we'll do now is we'll focus in on wiring and the point motors for this layout update. I spent most of the last month underneath the baseboards between near enough the ground and then the Fiddle Yard level. There's just about enough space for me to actually get into this section. I've propped up the baseboard sections that I had going spare underneath the main Fiddle Yard as basically extra storage rather than putting things right onto the floor. And so in this space here I've spent most of the month upside down. I got a trolley to support the rest of me. Spent it most of upside down and fitting in these terminal blocks with then basically a DCC bus wire linked between each of the terminal block sections, and I've then fed in off every single piece of track in the Fiddle Yard the positive and the negative off each side of the track into the respective terminal blocks. The terminal blocks here are then linked to the next set down the Fiddle Yard on this side of the layout. I've tried to then wire up each of the track sections on the Fiddle Yard right next to each other, so you'll see towards the right hand side there the dropper wires that come through. These are all very much in the same line where possible, so that they're all sort of the same sort of distance that are then linking into the terminal block sections that I have. I've changed the camera angle here slightly to then talk about two other things. So as I've just mentioned, you've got those terminal block sections for each of the bus wires, and you just about see on the far left, bottom left of the screen here, that there's the next section of bus wire and droppers, which are then screwed into the framework underneath the Fiddle Yard. So there's obviously a black and a red cable that are then linking those terminal blocks together to basically daisy chain those sections together, and then they'll feed back to the DCC main box that I have, which is a Z21. As part of doing these terminal blocks for the main bus wire, I've also used a similar principle then for the frog polarity switch on the electro frogs I've got on the Fiddle Yard, and these are for the green wires that are there. So I've got one wire which is coming out of the frog from the point work on the Fiddle Yard, and then the other wire there is going towards the point motor switch, which I've used the standard SEEP PM point motors for those to operate the switch and the polarity for the frog, so that I get a constant feed over the point work for whether it needs to be positive or negative, so I don't get any disruption with the trains running across the points. The DCC bus wire with the terminal blocks is very much the same then all the way around the layout, and I'll be using a similar setup for the other sections that I still need to wire up. The last thing to look at here in terms of the wiring that I've got completed is on the very far left. I have two other different colours which are then feeding my test track for DCC programming. That then comes out of the Z21 box out the back of that with a separate sort of wired connection for those ports, and then those other wires on the other side of that terminal block then feed into the track sections on the Fiddle Yard. And that's where we'll go and have a look now at the little section I've put in for my testing and programming of the trains when I need to DCC chip them, for example. In keeping with the theme for the sleepers on the Fiddle Yard section of the layout here, I've mentioned before that the concrete sleepers are the main running lines. Then you've got the wooden sleepers, which are going to be the sidings and for stabling the trains on the Fiddle Yard. And then what I've now put in is a test track and the programming track here at the very front, using the space that I've got left in the Fiddle Yard area. So it starts between the post on the left there and continues towards just over a length of track towards the next post on the right here, and that has used the steel sleepers from Pico to symbolise the test track and the programming track that I have. That then links in with those wires that I've just explained that go underneath the baseboard and to the Z21 box, which is specifically for programming locos that I need to then chip ready for DCC and the settings that are required for DCC around the layout. I mentioned earlier that I've made progress on about half the point motors for the main Fiddle Yard. Here are just two of them, which these sit in the very middle of the Fiddle Yard, just next to where we were discussing a minute ago, looking at the terminal blocks. And these point motors here are for the sidings at the very back of the Fiddle Yard. And a lot of time was spent first of all wiring these up. So each of these have been wired up individually using specific colour coding for then each of the different 6 wires that come off the point motors. I'll do a video in the future about how to wire up one of these SEEP point motors and what each of the different wires mean. But what I've started to do here is just connect up the power polarity switch on the point motors to the point then that is on the Fiddle Yard, and I'll come back and do the DCC wiring later on. So as a starter, these red and black wires, as I mentioned earlier, are for the DCC bus wires, and they're connected into the terminal blocks. And the green wire is, as I've explained earlier as well, on the right hand side you can see they're going into a terminal blocks to switch the polarity for the point on the Fiddle Yard. It's important to get these lined up exactly as they're meant to be. They can be very fiddly to sort out underneath, especially when then trying to screw these in upside down to the baseboard above when you're upside down putting these in. Best way I've found of attaching these to the board is to first of all just mark it out of where it needs to go. The pin that then protrudes through to the point and the baseboard above needs to be flexible in how it moves, and it also needs to be lined up correctly to switch the point when the magnets work for once the seat motor is fully set up to do the DCC point motors that I will then have operating through the Z21. I have around about another 10 to 12 point motors to fit down towards the rear end of the garage at the other end of the Fiddle Yard. That will then take me around onto what will be then the 2-track section of railway, which will then climb the incline or decline, whichever way the trains are running. So that's the target over the next month or so, is to get those last few point motors in, wire up the remainder of the layout, particularly for the Fiddle Yard, and the points that then lead towards the incline for the Trent Valley Railway. Before we get into watching a few trains move around on the Fiddle Yard section, now that most of it is wired up, just want to say a huge thank you to all the new subscribers to the channel, all those people who commented and liked the previous layout updates. Please do keep sending in comments, thoughts, suggestions. Do appreciate them, and I will try and respond to them as quickly as possible. There won't be too much more work going on now over the next couple of months, as it is the summer period. But stay tuned, there will be a update in August, and then there'll be a lot more updates through September and onwards towards the end of the year. Hope you enjoy this last part of the video for the July 2019 layout update with a few trains that are running on the Fiddle Yard.